The radio clicked once. Then it went silent. Private Daniel Mercer pressed the cracked handset closer to his ear, hoping the signal would return. It didn't. He wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand and tasted salt and dirt on his lips. Mud coated his boots. His helmet was scratched along the rim. His shoulders ached from carrying 70 pounds of gear through dense jungle for days. Somewhere beyond the tree line, artillery echoed like distant thunder. He pressed the transmit button again. Nothing. Daniel hadn't slept in almost 40 hours. Not real sleep. Just brief moments of unconsciousness between patrols, interrupted by mosquitoes, distant gunfire, or the constant fear that someone was watching. He looked over his shoulder. Lance Corporal Miguel Alvarez crouched beside a fallen log, scanning the tree line. Miguel was 22, a former auto mechanic from San Antonio. He still tried to joke when things got bad, said it kept his lungs working. Behind them, Navy corpsman Thomas Reed knelt beside a wounded Marine, wrapping gauze around a shrapnel cut with hands that shook despite his training. No one spoke. Talking wasted oxygen. The jungle felt too quiet. The last message they received had been incomplete. Only 3 words cut through the static. They're coming. Then silence. No coordinates. No follow-up. Just a dead channel in the middle of South Vietnam. 2 seconds passed. 3. Daniel stared at the radio as if it might apologize. It didn't. That was when he realized they were truly alone.
March 1969. Quang Tri Province. Near a nameless ridgeline that didn't appear on most maps. A small Marine platoon had been sent on what command called a routine reconnaissance patrol. The objective was vague. Search the area, look for signs of enemy movement, establish presence. They were told resistance would be light. They were told extraction would be easy. They were told a lot of things. None of them turned out to be true. This engagement would never receive an official battle name. In military records, it would be reduced to a single line: enemy contact. But for the men trapped there, it would become the longest day of their lives. Daniel Mercer was 19 years old. He carried a photograph of his younger sister folded inside a plastic sleeve in his breast pocket. She had braces and crooked bangs and a smile that reminded him of summers before everything became complicated. Daniel had enlisted straight out of high school. He believed the war would be over before he turned 20. By his 3rd month in country, he stopped counting days. Now he counted patrols. He counted magazines. He counted the men still standing beside him. Miguel Alvarez joined the Marines because college was too expensive, and his father's back couldn't handle another year of factory work. Miguel liked engines. He said they made sense. People didn't. He kept a small wrench in his pack as a good luck charm. That morning, before they moved out, he had checked Daniel's rifle without being asked. "Just making sure you don't die on me, hermano," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. Neither smiled. Thomas Reed had been drafted. He was 24. He trained as a medic because it felt useful. He didn't tell anyone that he fainted during his first anatomy class. Now he could pack wounds under fire. He wrote names in a waterproof notebook. He tried not to think about how many pages were left.
By 1969, the Vietnam War had already consumed tens of thousands of American lives. Search and destroy missions were routine. So were ambushes. Entire engagements vanished into paperwork. Maps were redrawn weekly. Villages changed hands. Soldiers rotated in and out. But trauma stayed. The strategy was simple on paper. Find the enemy, engage, withdraw. Reality was messier. The jungle swallowed sound. Enemy fighters blended into terrain, and radios failed at the worst possible moments. At 0617 local time, the ambush began. It started with a single crack. Then the jungle exploded. Automatic fire tore through leaves and branches. RPG rounds slammed into the perimeter. The first Marine went down before anyone fully registered what was happening. Daniel hit the dirt, heart slamming against his ribs, rifle shaking in his grip. Someone screamed for a corpsman.
Someone else didn't scream at all. Their radio operator was hit within the first 30 seconds. The antenna snapped clean off. Communication died with it. They were pinned down from 3 directions. Bullets chewed into tree trunks. Shrapnel rained down from overhead detonations. Miguel returned fire and controlled bursts, shouting positions to anyone who could hear him. Thomas crawled forward under fire, dragging a wounded Marine back by his webbing. Daniel tried to raise command. Static answered. Again and again. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't on the mission brief. This wasn't in the plan. But war doesn't ask for permission. Daniel felt his mouth go dry. He forced himself to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He fired when Miguel pointed, reloaded when told, counted rounds, checked corners. Somewhere nearby, a grenade detonated. The concussion rattled his teeth. He tasted blood. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours. He couldn't remember when he had last blinked. And somewhere beyond the smoke and chaos, unseen eyes watched their positions, waiting. This was the beginning, and it was only getting worse.
The firing never really stopped. It only changed direction. Rounds snapped overhead, tearing through palm leaves and bamboo stalks. Every few seconds, dirt erupted somewhere nearby as another explosive found its mark. Daniel Mercer kept his cheek pressed against the damp earth, breathing shallow and slow. His radio was still dead. He tried again anyway. Nothing. Miguel crawled over beside him, face streaked with sweat and grime. "They're probing," Miguel said. "Testing us." Daniel nodded. He didn't trust his voice. By 07, the platoon's perimeter had collapsed into a rough oval around a shallow depression in the ground. They had lost their original formation. Each Marine now fought from whatever scrap of cover he could find: a fallen tree, a termite mound, a shallow foxhole scraped out with trembling hands. They were surrounded. Enemy fire came in waves. Short bursts, then silence, then sudden explosions. It was textbook guerrilla tactics. Pressure, withdrawal, pressure again. The goal wasn't to overwhelm. It was to exhaust. Thomas Reed moved continuously, from one casualty to the next. He crawled through mud and blood, applying pressure dressings, injecting morphine, whispering reassurances he didn't fully believe himself. A Marine with shrapnel in his abdomen kept asking for water. Thomas couldn't give him any. A corporal with a collapsed lung tried to sit up. Thomas pushed him back down. "Stay with me." He said it to everyone.
At 7:42, they attempted their first call for air support. Daniel held the handset high, standing fully exposed for nearly 10 seconds. Miguel covered him. Rounds kicked up dirt inches from Daniel's boots. Static answered his transmission. He ducked back down. They tried again. Still nothing. The enemy had either jammed their frequency or destroyed their relay point. Either way, they were invisible. Miguel fired until his rifle overheated. He swapped magazines with practice speed, shouting coordinates, directing fire, forcing himself into leadership because someone had to do it. Between bursts, he muttered prayers in Spanish. He had stopped joking. By mid-morning, the heat became unbearable. Humidity pressed against their lungs. Sweat soaked through uniforms. Flies gathered around open wounds. Daniel's hands cramped from gripping his weapon. He had fired so many rounds he could no longer tell individual shots apart. Everything blurred into one continuous roar. A young private named Collins took a round through the shoulder. He cried out for his mother. Thomas dragged him behind cover and packed the wound. Collins tried to apologize. "I'm sorry, Doc. I'm sorry." Thomas told him to save his strength. Collins nodded, then went quiet. Thomas checked his pulse. There wasn't one. He wrote Collins' name down anyway.
At 10:15, the enemy shifted tactics. Instead of long-range fire, they began closing distance. Figures moved between trees. Camouflage shapes advanced through smoke. Daniel saw one briefly, just a silhouette, before Miguel dropped him. Grenades started landing inside the perimeter. One detonated near a machine gun position. 2 Marines were thrown backward. One didn't get up. They were running low on ammunition, low on water, low on hope. Daniel's vision narrowed. His ears rang constantly. He felt detached from his own body, like he was watching everything through thick glass. This was dissociation, a survival response, the mind protecting itself from overload. At 11:30, they attempted extraction. A smoke signal was deployed. Red canister, the color of emergency. Daniel stood again, waving his arms, screaming into the radio. This time, faint voices crackled through. Broken, fragmented. He caught only pieces. Copy. Stand by. Air inbound. It wasn't much, but it was something. Minutes later, the distant thump of helicopter blades reached them. The sound cut through gunfire like a promise. Miguel looked up, eyes wide. "They heard us," he said. Daniel nodded. He felt something rise in his chest that almost resembled hope. 2 Hueys approached low and fast. Enemy fire intensified immediately. Tracer rounds stitched the air. One helicopter veered off. The other attempted to descend. A rocket streaked upward. It struck the tail boom. The aircraft spun violently, then disappeared behind the tree line. There was no explosion they could see, just silence where the rotors had been. No one spoke. They all understood. The extraction had failed. Again. Enemy forces surged forward, sensing weakness. The Marines pulled tighter together, back to back, covering angles. Miguel took command without ceremony. "Watch your sectors. Reload now. Don't chase." Daniel followed orders automatically. He no longer thought in sentences, only actions. Aim, fire, move, breathe. Thomas ran out of morphine. He began tearing strips from his own undershirt to bind wounds. One Marine with severe burns begged him not to leave. Thomas stayed until the man stopped breathing, then moved on. There were others. There were always others. By early afternoon, the perimeter had shrunk to less than 30 meters. Bodies lay where they fell. Some were pulled into cover. Some weren't. Daniel stepped over a helmet he recognized. He didn't look inside it. Miguel was hit just after 14 o'clock. A round caught him high in the chest. He stumbled backward, dropping his rifle. Daniel reached him first. Miguel tried to speak. Blood bubbled at his lips. He pressed something into Daniel's hand. The small wrench. Then his eyes went empty. Daniel closed them with shaking fingers. Thomas recorded Miguel Alvarez at 14:07. He underlined the name. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Every minute felt stolen. They waited for air support that didn't come. They rationed bullets. They rationed hope. And somewhere in the jungle, unseen forces prepared for one final push. They didn't know it yet, but the worst was still ahead. By late afternoon, the jungle seemed to breathe. Not literally, but Daniel Mercer could feel it. Every movement of leaves felt deliberate. Every shadow looked like a man. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and mud. His shoulders burned from recoil. His jaw ached from clenching. He no longer knew how long they had been fighting. Time had stopped behaving normally. Minutes stretched into eternity, then collapsed. This was what prolonged combat did to the brain. Sleep deprivation, dehydration, and adrenaline combined to fracture perception. Some Marines later said they saw faces in the smoke. Others heard music. Daniel heard his sister laughing. He shook his head violently to clear it. Thomas Reed had stopped counting casualties. He moved mechanically now. Apply pressure. Check airway. Move on. His gloves were slick with blood. He had lost his sense of smell hours earlier. At one point, he realized he was whispering to himself. Just fragments of sentences. "You're okay. Keep going. Almost there." He wasn't sure who he was talking to.
A Marine named Harris clutched Thomas's arm. "Doc," Harris said, eyes wide. "I don't feel my legs." Thomas looked down. There was nothing below Harris's waist. Thomas told him to look at his face. He held eye contact until Harris stopped breathing. Then Thomas closed Harris's eyes. He wrote the name. His notebook was nearly full.
Daniel crouched behind a shattered log and tried to reload. His hands wouldn't cooperate. They shook violently. He dropped the magazine twice. He forced his fingers to obey. His ears rang constantly. The sound never stopped. He was no longer afraid. He was beyond fear. He existed in a narrow tunnel of action. Shoot. Reload. Scan. Breathe. At 16:20, enemy fire suddenly ceased. The silence was worse than the gunshots. Every Marine froze. They knew what this meant. The enemy was repositioning, preparing. Daniel peeked over the edge of his cover. Smoke drifted lazily through the trees. Birds had gone quiet. Even insects seemed to pause. Miguel should have been beside him. Instead, there was only empty space. Thomas took shelter beside Daniel. He leaned back against a tree, chest heaving. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to sit. He pulled something from his pocket. A folded letter. He hadn't read it yet. He had been saving it for later. Later never came. The letter was from Miguel's mother. She had sent copies to anyone whose address Miguel had given her. She wrote about repainting the kitchen, about how Miguel's younger brother had finally learned to ride a bike. She said she prayed every night. She said she was proud. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it back into his pocket. He didn't tell Daniel. Some things felt too heavy to share.
Psychologists call this stage combat fatigue. The body has been pushed past sustainable limits. Reaction time slows, memory fragments, decision-making becomes instinctive, fine motor control disappears. Survivor's guilt begins before survival is even confirmed. Daniel realized he hadn't had water in hours. His tongue felt swollen. He licked condensation from a leaf. He didn't care what lived on it. At 17:05, the final assault began. Enemy forces emerged from multiple directions, not charging, advancing deliberately, using trees as cover, closing distance meter by meter. Daniel fired until his rifle clicked empty. He switched weapons with a wounded Marine. Thomas dragged another casualty behind cover. Someone screamed for air support. Someone else screamed for their father. Grenades detonated inside the perimeter. Shrapnel tore through packs and flesh. One Marine lost both hands. Another took fragments to the throat. Thomas pressed gauze into wounds that would not close. He felt himself slipping, emotionally detached, watching himself work from somewhere far away. Daniel was knocked backward by a nearby explosion. He slammed into the ground. Stars burst across his vision. When he stood, his helmet was gone. Blood ran into his eyes. He wiped it away and raised his rifle again. He didn't remember making the decision. His body did it for him. At approximately 18:10, the sound of jet engines cut through the chaos. Two fast movers screamed overhead. Moments later, bombs impacted beyond the tree line. The earth shook violently. Enemy fire faltered, then stopped. Smoke billowed skyward. The Marines didn't cheer. They were too tired. They simply stayed where they were, waiting to see if the jungle would attack again.
Helicopters arrived shortly after sunset. This time, no rockets followed them. Door gunners opened fire into the surrounding vegetation as medevac birds hovered just above the clearing. Daniel helped load casualties onto stretchers. He recognized faces. He avoided others. Thomas handed off his last patient and collapsed onto the ground. He didn't cry. He stared at nothing. They evacuated the survivors just before full darkness. Daniel sat on the helicopter floor, knees drawn to his chest. Miguel's helmet lay beside him. It was still warm. Thomas rode out with 3 casualties who didn't make it to the field hospital. He washed his hands afterward until his skin cracked. Later, when Daniel tried to remember how many men they lost, he couldn't be sure. 17. Maybe more. Numbers felt meaningless. Faces stayed. That night, Daniel dreamed of radios. They kept ringing. He couldn't answer them.
The official report took less than 2 pages. It listed times, grid coordinates, estimated enemy strength, friendly casualties, equipment lost. There was no room in the document for Miguel's small wrench, no place to record the way Thomas Reed's hand shook when he finally sat down, no section for the way Daniel Mercer stared at the floor of the helicopter, unable to lift his eyes. The engagement was categorized as enemy contact. Then it was archived, another line in a war that produced thousands of them. Daniel was flown to a rear base for evaluation. They checked his hearing, his vision. They asked him basic questions: name, rank, date. He answered automatically. They offered him water. He drank without tasting it. That night, he lay on a cot beneath a canvas roof and listened to other men cry quietly in the dark. He didn't join them. He couldn't. Something inside him felt sealed shut.
Thomas Reed filled out casualty cards until dawn. He wrote carefully, legibly. He double-checked spellings. He made sure service numbers were correct. He treated paperwork with the same seriousness he had given to wounds. It was all he had left to offer. When he finally stopped moving, he vomited behind the aid station, then returned to work. No reporters arrived. No photographers documented the clearing. The jungle reclaimed the blood-soaked ground within days. Rain washed away footprints. New leaves covered blast scars. Within weeks, it was impossible to tell that 17 young men had died there. The war moved on. So did command. Replacement Marines filled empty slots. Patrol schedules continued. Another platoon walked through that same region months later without ever knowing what had happened. Daniel Mercer returned to Ohio in early 1970. He was 20 years old. He worked construction during the day. He drank beer in silence at night. He married his high school girlfriend because it felt like the next logical step. He learned to smile again. But he didn't sleep well. He woke before dawn every March. He listened for radios that weren't there. He avoided fireworks. He never spoke about Miguel.
Thomas Reed left medicine. He tried working in a pharmacy, then an office, then a warehouse. He couldn't tolerate the smell of antiseptic. He couldn't walk past emergency rooms. He carried a folded letter in his wallet for decades. He never told Miguel's mother that he had been there. He didn't know how without warning. The brain remembered drawer beside her bed. She reread it every anniversary. She memorized his handwriting. She placed his photograph on the mantel and dusted it weekly. She never learned the exact circumstances of his death, only that he had served with honor, only that he had been brave. Official notifications don't explain how someone held the line. They don't mention small wrenches. The battle never received a name. It doesn't appear in history textbooks. There are no monuments, no plaques, no guided tours. Students don't study it. Veterans don't organize reunions around it. It exists only in fragments, in medical records, in faded letters, in the quiet memories of those who survived. Years later, Daniel tried to explain it to his daughter. He told her about the heat, about how heavy the gear was, about how sometimes you don't feel scared until much later. She listened politely. She couldn't imagine it. He didn't blame her. Some experiences resist translation.
Historians track wars through major offensives and political decisions, but conflict is actually made of small, unnamed moments. A Marine closing his friend's eyes, a medic writing down one more name, a 19-year-old staring at blood on his hands, wondering how he made it home when others didn't. These moments don't change borders, they change people. The ridgeline near Quang Tri remains unmarked. Local farmers walk past it every day. Children play nearby. Life continues. Somewhere beneath the soil, fragments of metal still rest quietly. Shell casings, shrapnel, evidence of a day that mattered deeply to a few dozen men and almost no one else. Not all battles are remembered. Not all sacrifices are recorded. Some conflicts fade without ceremony. They leave no headlines behind.
only echoes. Daniel Mercer still keeps his sister's photograph in a drawer. He added Miguel's wrench beside it. Thomas Reed still writes names carefully. He does it now for different reasons, but the habit remains. Some battles end. Others keep playing softly in the background of a person's life. This was the battle everyone forgot, but the voices are still here, waiting in the static.